Hey guys, tonight we are going to leave our warm beds, our well-stocked fridges, and our delivery apps behind and travel back to a time when your next meal was not only uncertain, but almost certainly terrible. Imagine, just for a moment, the worst meal you've ever had, maybe a gluey gas station sandwich, or that rubbery chicken served on a plane that looked more like medical equipment than poultry. Got it in mind? Okay, now imagine eating something far worse than that, every single day. That is where we are headed tonight. And let's be honest, faced with the daily reality of this menu, you probably won't survive this. Not because you're weak, but because your modern immune system is no match for what's coming. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. In the comments, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is. I love seeing this little community stretch across time zones. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your day begins in darkness. Not just because it's winter and the sun hasn't bothered to rise yet, but because there are no windows in your one-room crook house. Your world is defined by what the flicker of your hearth can touch, the jagged silhouette of the wall, the burlap sack hanging from a beam, the unbothered rat peering at you from the thatched roof. You stare under a wool blanket stiff with smoke, stretch your aching legs, and stand. The earth floor beneath you is cold and damp, familiar, and not in a good way. The smoky haze in the room isn't just morning fog. It's a permanent resident. It coils from the open hearth like a snake, clinging low to the ground. There's no chimney, just a small hole in the roof and the vague hope that most of it will eventually drift out. Your eyes sting. You cough. This is how it has always been. The walls around you are rough, lumpy things, mud, straw, and animal dung, pressed onto a crude wooden frame. It's called wattle and daub, though nobody calls it that here. They just call it home. The smoke-blackened ceiling droops with cobwebs and dust, and somewhere above, wasps are already stirring. You ignore them. There are worse things to worry about. In the center of it all hangs the great cast-iron cauldron, suspended over the fire. It's not just cookware. It's a member of the family. Its soot-black sides glisten with years of use. It's never emptied, never cleaned. It bubbles quietly with the same meal you had yesterday, and the day before, and every day stretching back to your earliest memory. This is your breakfast, your lunch, and your dinner, the eternal pottage. The concept of a perpetual stew is a mainstream historical fact. The pot was kept simmering day after day, topped up with whatever could be found: grain, scraps of meat, a few leaves from a garden. It was a microbial melting pot of survival. If the stew stopped, the family stopped. You dip a ladle into the pot and fill a wooden bowl. It's lukewarm, watery, and already separating into layers. The top is a translucent sheen of grease, the middle thick with oat grit, and the bottom hiding something that may once have been a turnip. You don't think too hard about it. As you lift the bowl to your lips, you take a moment to inspect what floats inside. Is that a pea? A bit of barley? A twig? Could be any of those things. Or none. It doesn't matter. You eat it, spoonful by spoonful, without comment. This isn't about pleasure. This is about fuel. The taste is, charitably, forgettable. A blend of overcooked greens, smoke, and bitterness. Occasionally, there's a sour note that raises questions you're too hungry to ask. You choose something that might be a piece of leather or a particularly old parsnip. You don't stop chewing long enough to find out. This morning, you're lucky. There's a small crust of bread to go with it. It's not soft. It's not warm. It's not even entirely brown. The bread is hard enough to be a tool. You break off a chunk and dunk it into the stew, softening it just enough to gnaw. This routine is as practiced as brushing your teeth, except you've never heard of brushing your teeth. A quirky detail here. This bread isn't just bad. It's actively dangerous. Filled with husk, ground coarsely, and sometimes cut with sand or even clay to stretch the flour further. Over time, it wears your teeth flat. By 30, most peasants have ground their molars down to nubs. Eating is a slow erosion. As you eat, you can't help but glance at the pot again. It's still full, but it's full of time, not abundance. You know what's in there, because you put it there. The same handful of oats from yesterday. The same water from the stream. The same limp weeds you foraged near the fence line. It's all there, flavor circling endlessly, never improving. Historians still argue whether the contents of the peasant's pot changed much with the seasons. Some suggest a little more greenery in spring, maybe more roots in fall. But the consensus: the stew was nearly the same year-round. Monotonous, gritty, and bland beyond belief. You finish the bowl. Your stomach is not full, just slightly less hollow. Outside, the morning mist is lifting, revealing the muddy strip of land that you'll be working all day. There's no rest, no second cup of coffee, just the memory of that lukewarm pottage slowly settling like wet gravel in your belly. And with that, the day begins. The fire still crackles softly behind you as you step outside into the wet morning. Your breath clouds the air, your thin wool tunic already damp from the mist that seems to coat everything in your world. The sun is up, technically, but it offers little warmth, just a pale, apologetic glow behind thick gray clouds. You trudge past the garden plot beside your home, the tuft. It's little more than a ragged patch of overworked soil and slumped wooden fencing. Whatever vegetables it gave you last season are gone, and what's left is a memory of cabbage roots and weeds. One stray leek stands defiant in the mud. You consider pulling it now, but decide against it. Let it suffer a little longer, like the rest of you. Back inside, the pottage bubbles faintly. The cauldron never stops. You don't clean it. No one does. Cleaning would be wasteful. You just keep adding to it. More water, more grit, more scraps. The iron is stained black from soot and years of desperate meals. You imagine, not entirely jokingly, that if you stopped feeding the pot, it would simply consume you instead. This ancient tradition, keeping the pot always simmering, is a mainstream historical fact. It's called a perpetual stew, or sometimes a forever soup. You didn't make this meal today. You inherited it from yesterday, from your grandmother, from every hand that's ever stirred this cauldron. It's both your burden and your legacy. You reach for the grain sack tucked in the corner. It's already feeling suspiciously light. You untie it and scoop out a handful of oats. Not flour, just oats. Coarse, with bits of chaff still clinging to them. Some of it looks a little darker than the rest. You don't ask why. Into the pot it goes, and you give it a stir. Your mind drifts as the water takes on that familiar milky color. This is the rhythm of your life. Add something. Stir. Take something out. Stir again. The pottage is like time. It loops endlessly without beginning or end. But today, your stomach grumbles again before the stew even thickens. You dip in a ladle and taste what can only be described as hot, soggy bitterness. You swallow it anyway. The texture is grainy, with the faintest crunch of dirt between your molars. The flavor isn't offensive. Offensive would be exciting. It's the absence of flavor. It's edible nothingness. That's the worst part. You're not even disappointed anymore. There's no hope of change, no thought that tomorrow's pottage might be different. It never is. There's no garlic, no onion, no fat for frying, no butter to spread, no salt. Unless someone's bartered for it, and they rarely do. All of those luxuries are for someone else. People who don't live in mud huts. Still, you can't help but remember a story your uncle told you once. About a pottage someone made that actually tasted good. He swore it had leeks and bacon in it. Bacon. You laugh then, thinking he'd gone soft in the head. Now you wonder if he dreamed it just to feel something. As you ladle out a portion for a mid-morning meal, you glance at the pot and realize something slightly alarming. A bubble pops on the surface, and a sliver of mold floats up from the depths. You scoop it out quickly and flick it into the fire. One crisis averted. Historians still argue about how often medieval pottage actually went bad. With the fire always lit and the pot always simmering, it probably didn't spoil as quickly as raw ingredients did. But in warm weather, and with inconsistent boiling, there's no guarantee. Some days the pot is more biology experiment than meal. You take your bowl to the small table in the corner, its surface warped from years of humidity and spills. A cracked wooden spoon sits where you left it yesterday. You scoop up a mouthful and chew. Or rather, you process it. You don't really chew pottage. It's more of a negotiation with your throat. A fringe historical tidbit. In some parts of Europe, families reportedly seasoned their pottage with dried blood or used bone broth to give it depth. That sounds luxurious to you. Bone broth requires bones, and blood dries quickly when it's soaked into a dirt floor. Across the table, your youngest child stirs in her sleep. She's curled up on a straw mattress, sharing a blanket with her sister. You watch her ribs rise and fall. That alone is enough to keep you going. She'll wake soon and need something to eat. And when she does, all you'll have to offer is this same pottage. You think briefly about flavor, about what it must be like to taste something unexpected, something sharp or sweet or fatty. Then you crush the thought. Hope is dangerous. Hope tastes worse than disappointment. You finish the bowl. You don't scrape it. Every bit has already been eaten. The wooden spoon clinks softly against the side. You return it to the pot, stir again, and let it bubble quietly. It's your constant companion, your family's hearth and heart. It's alive in a way. And as you step back outside, ready for the long day of work ahead, you feel the familiar weight settle in your belly. Not satisfaction, never satisfaction, just mass. Just a warm blob of barley grit and bitterness holding you upright. It will have to be enough. By midday, the weak light has flattened everything into shades of brown, mud, sky, tunic thoughts. You've been in the field since sunrise, bent at the waist, tearing weeds from rows of nearly barren crops. Your back aches. Your hands are caked with soil. Your stomach, despite the pottage, has started its familiar complaining again. You reach into your satchel and pull out what passes for a midday meal, a hunk of bread. Well, bread is what you generously call it. This is not a crusty baguette, a sourdough boule, or even the squishy sandwich bread of modern grocery aisles. This is maslin bread, heavy, gray, and astonishingly solid. It's the culinary equivalent of a brick with abandonment issues. The loaf was baked over a week ago at the communal oven. You remember the walk to the village center, dough in hand, knowing full well that the Lord's oven, your only legal baking option, would take its cut in flour as payment. That's the banality again, one of those little feudal obligations that follows you like a bad smell. You pay to bake the bread you made from the grain you grew on the land you don't own. It's enough to make you laugh, if it weren't so infuriating. You take a bite, or rather, you attempt to. The crust resists like a boot heel. You end up sawing off a corner with your knife, the same knife you use for mending tools, gutting fish, and cleaning under your nails. Sanitation isn't really the vibe here. The taste is sour, chewy, dense enough to absorb sound. It's made from a rough mix of rye and wheat, or just rye, if the wheat harvest failed. The flour is coarse and full of husk and bran. You can feel the grit between your teeth, and you will feel it for hours. Here's a mainstream historical fact. Maslin bread was the go-to for most medieval peasants. White bread, manchet, was reserved for the wealthy. The more refined and pale your loaf, the higher your social status. Your bread, by contrast, is so dark and sour it might qualify as a vegetable. There's even a quirky belief tied to this, that peasants' bread could be so hard it was used as a weapon or a tool. Stories tell of loaves used to prop doors open or knock sense into unruly children. Whether or not that's true, the weight of this one in your hand makes it seem entirely plausible. You dunk the bread in water from your flask of small ale, not to flavor it. There's no flavor left to coax out, but to soften the crust enough to chew without chipping a molar. This is how you get through the meal. Soften, gnaw, chew, repeat. Historians still argue whether this gritty texture was due to poor milling equipment or intentional adulteration. Some suspect millers bulked out flour with fillers, sand, chalk, ground beans, even sawdust. After all, the peasants wouldn't know. Not until the fillings in their teeth started screaming. Just kidding, no one has fillings. Only aching sockets and silent regrets. And if you're unlucky, truly unlucky, your bread might be laced with something worse. Rye, your staple grain, has a nasty habit of carrying ergot, a toxic fungus that mimics grain but causes everything from burning pain to terrifying hallucinations. But we'll get to that later. For now, it's just you, the field, and your sorrow loaf. You look down at the bread in your hands and wonder, again, if there's a splinter in it. You pull a bit from the middle and chew slowly, letting your jaw do the work your stomach will soon regret. Bread is not a treat. It is not a vehicle for flavor. It is survival, compressed into a sour, gray puck. It's what you get when luxury runs out and hunger sticks around. And somehow, despite it all, you still worry about running out. You glance at your satchel. One more piece left. That's for tonight. Or tomorrow. You haven't decided yet. The real decision will be made by your stomach when it starts yelling again like a tiny, angry priest. You look up. Across the field, you see your neighbor doing the same thing. Biting, tearing, dunking, chewing. No one talks. No one savors. Everyone is just trying to get through the next hour without fainting. Somewhere in the village, a dog barks. A crow caws from a skeletal tree. You chew. You swallow. You keep working. You used to dream about fresh bread, the kind you've heard about in songs and stories. Bread that's soft. Bread that smells sweet and warm. Bread that comes with butter. That dream has become dangerous now. It makes your current meal taste worse. So you chase it away. The crust cuts the roof of your mouth. You spit a tiny fleck of blood into the mud. The taste is stronger than the bread. As you finish the last bite, you sigh. Your stomach doesn't feel full. Just occupied. That'll have to be enough. You dust your hands on your tunic. Pick up your hoe. Return to the weeds. And tell yourself that, yes, you've eaten, even if your teeth disagree. The sun creeps across the sky, an indifferent smear of pale light behind clouds that promise rain without delivering. You stay in the field, knees aching, hands rough and raw, digging weeds from shallow soil. But your thoughts aren't on weeds anymore. They are on the growing emptiness in your home. The slow, terrifying slide toward the hungry gap. It starts small. A missing carrot. A thinner slice of bread. You tell yourself it's nothing. But deep down, you know, the stores are dwindling. The grain sack, once swollen after harvest, now folds like an empty sleeve. The last dried peas have been stirred into the stew. Even the salted fish in the barrel are down to leathery scraps, clinging to their bones like barnacles. You enter the hungry gap. This is a mainstream historical fact. The hungry gap was a stretch from late spring to early summer when last year's food was nearly gone, and this year's crops weren't ready. It's not dramatic, not sudden. It's slow, it's quiet, and it kills more surely than famine. Outside, everything looks alive. The fields are greening. The birds sing. But the grain isn't ready. The vegetables haven't grown. You live surrounded by food you cannot eat. It's like being trapped in a pantry with locked cabinets. The keys just weeks out of reach. At home, meals get smaller, thinner. The pottage is now a faint brown broth with a few lonely floating grains. The bread slices grow narrow and stale, and the crusts crack your lips when you bite. You notice how often you find excuses to skip dinner. You tell your children you've already eaten. You lie, and they believe you. You wake up dizzy. Your arms tremble with exertion after only a few minutes in the field. You sit more often, eyes unfocused, heart fluttering like a trapped bird. Your muscles start to shrink. Your belly doesn't just ache, it burns. A quirky little tidbit from this period. Peasants sometimes chewed willow bark to distract from hunger. Not for calories, but because its bitter taste gave them something. Ironically, willow bark contains salicin, a compound similar to aspirin. They weren't curing anything, but at least their headaches faded a little. You chew on a piece now, and for a second, the bitterness makes you forget how empty you are. Then the feeling returns, worse than before. Around the village, faces grow hollow. People speak less. The children are quiet, not because they are well-behaved, but because their bodies are conserving what little energy they have. You see one child sitting beside the well, head drooping, mouth slack. Her belly is distended, not from fullness, but from malnutrition. The paradox is cruel, bloated, but starving. Your elderly neighbor stumbles as he walks past. He mutters something, then forgets what he was saying. He sits in the dirt and stays there. No one tells him to get up. Everyone just watches. Historians still argue whether this level of seasonal starvation was universal across medieval Europe or more common in specific regions. Some records suggest entire villages were wiped out during particularly bad gaps. Others claim that strong community bonds and local trade kept the worst of it at bay. But your community isn't trading. It's rationing. Quietly, desperately, daily. Even the smell in the air has changed. There's no longer the sour tang of cabbage or smoke. Just damp, silence, and the unspoken weight of waiting. You dream of food more now. Not feasts, just roasted onions. A carrot with flavor. A piece of warm bread that doesn't cut your gums. You dream of biting into a fresh apple. And when you wake, your teeth are clenched so tightly that your jaw aches. One day, your child brings you a beetle. She holds it out like a prize. It's big, she says. Maybe it tastes good. You smile weakly and take it, pretending to admire it before tossing it into the fire the second she looks away. You don't have the heart to tell her she's too hungry to tell the difference between food and bugs. You start stretching every meal. The pottage is now half water. You scrape the mill dust from the bottom of the flour bag, the stuff you once threw away, and use it. The bread you bake with it is gritty, bitter, and almost inedible. But you eat it anyway. You try to forage, but there's little left. Even the nettles have been picked clean. You nibble on leaves you don't recognize. You boil bark. You pretend it's broth. There's a phrase passed around the village now. It's just a few more weeks. You hear it constantly, said like a prayer, a chant, a threadbare promise. And you repeat it too. Just a few more weeks. Just a few more weeks. Just a few. The forest waits at the edge of your world, shadowed, silent, and forbidden. You don't go there casually. The trees are tall and thick, the kind that keeps secrets and swallows sound. But now, with the hungry gap gnawing into your family's bones, you find yourself staring at the woods like a starving man stares at a locked pantry. You don't want to go in, but you must. You grab a sack, rough burlap, stained with grease and thyme, and head out before sunrise. You don't tell anyone where you're going, not even your wife, especially not your wife. If you get caught in the Lord's woods, it's not just a slap on the wrist. It's prison, fines, mutilation, or death. Still, you walk toward the trees, heart thudding louder than your steps. This isn't a stroll. It's a scavenger hunt with high stakes and low odds. The goal isn't a feast. It's calories. You're not picky. You're not proud. You're not hopeful. You're just desperate. You start with the familiar, nettles. You use a cloth to gather the stinging leaves, knowing they'll lose their bite once boiled. They're bitter, but they fill space in the pot. Next, dandelions. Leaves, roots, even the yellow heads. Everything goes into the sack. A little deeper into the woods, you spot wild garlic. That pungent green blast is as close to flavor as you've had in weeks. You snap it off with reverence, like finding a silver coin in the mud. A mainstream historical fact. Foraging was essential to the medieval diet. Even peasants with gardens and grain relied heavily on the commons, woods, hedgerows, and meadows for wild greens and herbs. But with private land expanding and forest law tightening, foraging was increasingly risky. You press on. You skin the ground for pig nuts, tiny underground tubers that taste like mild hazelnuts. You find one, just one. You dig carefully around the thin stem, loosening the soil with your fingers, whispering to yourself as if you'll scare it off. Victory, but the thrill fades fast. One pig nut won't feed a child, let alone a family. You need more. You dig until your fingers go numb, and still you find only dirt. There's a patch of roots nearby. You pause. They look like wild parsnips, maybe, but they could also be hemlock waterdropwort. You've heard the stories. Families that made stew from the wrong root and died with twisted smiles on their faces. A fringe fact. The poison in hemlock waterdropwort causes facial muscles to contract in a grotesque grin called a sardonic smile. It's not a myth. It's a very real, very painful death. You back away. Mushrooms come next. You've always been warned. Only pick the ones you know, your grandmother said. But right now, you think you might remember which ones are safe. You find a cluster with wide, white caps. They look like field mushrooms. You squint. Could be. Might not be. Historians still argue whether the average peasant possessed deep foraging knowledge or relied more on superstition and guesswork. Maybe there was a folk science passed down like stories. Maybe most of it was luck. You pick one, sniff it, rub a bit on your skin. No rash. That means nothing. You place it carefully in the bag. Your stomach growls. You tell it to shut up. As you work, the forest watches. You imagine the Lord's foresters hiding behind every tree, ready to drag you back to the manor for stealing his plants. You remember that everything here is technically off limits. Even the squirrels, the berries, the bird song. It all belongs to someone else. But you keep going. At one point, you chew a piece of bark. It's dry, splintery, completely flavorless, but it feels like food. That counts for something. Then you hear it. Footsteps. Not yours. You freeze, your sack clutched to your chest. The underbrush crackles. A deer? A boar? A forester? You duck behind a tree, pulse racing. The forest goes quiet. You wait. Minutes pass. Nothing moves. Slowly you rise, heart hammering, and slink back toward the path. You filled your sack, barely. Greens, roots, a few questionable mushrooms. A handful of bitter berries that will sting your gums. Enough for one thin pot of stew. The walk back is longer. The sack weighs almost nothing. But the fear? That's heavy. You pass the village threshold as the sun rises fully, casting gold over the muddy paths and crooked rooftops. Home smells like with smoke and resignation. Inside, you empty your findings into the pot. The leaves wilt. The roots sink. The mushrooms float uncertainly. You light the fire and stir. You wonder if this stew will save your family or poison them. But you don't wonder long, because hunger doesn't leave time for doubt. The stars are still up when you slip out the door again, sack under one arm, your breath fogging in the cold morning air. The pottage from last night didn't make anyone sick, but it didn't make anyone better either. Your children are still too quiet. Your wife's eyes, though she doesn't say it, are ringed with fatigue. No one asks where you're going this time. They all know. It's written in the hollows beneath your cheekbones. This time, you're not foraging. You're poaching. The forest is darker than usual today, the canopy thick overhead. You move quietly, every snap twig underfoot making your heart leap. You have no bow, no arrows, not even a real trap, just a thin length of twine and a stick bent into the shape of a snare. It's barely a tool, but it might be enough. This isn't sport. This is criminal desperation. You remember what they did to that boy last spring, found with a skinned hair tucked under his tunic. His hands were tied behind his back. He was marched to the manor and whipped in front of everyone. And that was merciful. You don't think you'd be so lucky. Still, you keep walking. This is a mainstream historical fact. Hunting was not a right for the average peasant. It was a jealously guarded privilege of the nobility. Forest laws in medieval England, especially under the Normans, were vicious. Kill a deer, and you could lose your hands. Repeat offenders, you'd swing from the gallows. Even owning a dog large enough to chase a deer was illegal unless it had been expedited, its front toes chopped off. And yet here you are, setting your snare. You find a rabbit run, a faint line in the undergrowth where the grass has been pressed down by tiny feet. You anchor the loop, tuck it carefully beneath a bush, and step back. Now, you wait. While you do, you scan for other signs, burrows, fresh droppings, anything. You chew a bit of grass to calm your nerves. It doesn't work. Some say poachers had a secret language. Marks carved into trees. Knots tied in certain ways. Signals only they could read. Historians debate whether this was true or just romantic myth. But you like to imagine it's real. That others like you have walked this same path, quietly rebelling one snare at a time. A rustle nearby. You freeze. A rabbit darts out. Small, fast, ooze high. It pauses, sniffs, hops forward. The snare tightens with a sudden jerk. The rabbit flails once, then stills. You don't cheer. You don't smile. You just move fast. You sprint to the snare, untie it with shaking hands, and tuck the still-warm rabbit inside your tunic. The heat of it makes your heart pound harder. The fur brushes your chest. You can already imagine the weight of meat in the pot. The soft sigh of your daughter as she swallows something that actually tastes like food. And then you hear something else. Voices. You duck low behind a stump, holding your breath. The voices are distant. Foresters, maybe. Men with spears and dogs. You listen hard. Heart thudding so loud you fear they'll hear it. They pass. You exhale only when the sound of their boots fades into nothing. You scurry home like a rat. Each step a risk. A farmer's son caught with meat is a criminal. A threat to the Lord's table. The deer, the rabbits, the boars, they belong to him. Even though you live beside them. Even though your children cry for food. You reach your hut and slam the door quietly behind you. Inside, it's dim. Quiet. Cold. You pull the rabbit out. It's limp. A small, furry miracle. Your wife gasps. Your son's eyes widen. No one speaks. You skin it quickly. Your knife, still sticky with dried mud, makes short work of it. You burn the fur in the fire. Careful not to let the smoke billow too high. The bones and innards are buried in the garden. There must be no sign of this crime. The meat is scant. Tiny legs, thin ribs. It won't feed everyone on its own. But that's where the pottage comes in. You dice the meat, toss it into the simmering pot, and stay. The broth clouds immediately. The smell changes, richer, wilder, the scent of something that once ran and breathed. You taste the steam rising from the pot. It's real. Dinner is a reverent affair. You ladle small bowls for everyone, careful to keep the chunks of meat evenly distributed. Your daughter takes one bite and stops. Then she swallows, her eyes close. You've never seen her look so peaceful. You eat too, savoring every tiny, chewy piece. It's tough, gamey, perfect. It tastes like life. You've broken the law. You've risked everything. And you'll do it again. Because tonight, your children sleep with full stomachs. And that's worth every shadow in the woods. The morning after the rabbit, your stomach is still carrying the echo of real food. It's a comforting ache, like the kind you get after eating too much, but not from fullness. From difference. From having had meat, even if just a taste. The pottage today seems richer, even though it's not. The memory of flavor lingers. But something else lingers too. A different, drier ache in the back of your throat. You need something to drink. You reach for the jug. It's not water, because water, in your world, is dangerous. The stream runs just behind your village, a lazy, shallow vein that winds through cow pasture, mud paths, and waste heaps. On the surface, it looks fine, maybe a bit cloudy, but underneath, it's a cocktail of rot. That stream is where animals wade, where people wash their linens, and where waste from every cesspit eventually trickles. This isn't poetic exaggeration. It's a mainstream historical fact. Most medieval people, especially in rural areas, drank very little untreated water. They understood, if not the science, at least the pattern. Water made people sick. Instead, you drink ale. Small ale. A weak, sour, fizzy liquid that tastes like watery bread soaked in vinegar and left in a warm basement. And that's when it's good. You pour yourself a mug and sip. It's cloudy, tangy, barely alcoholic, maybe 1% or 2% ABV at most. But it's safe. The reason is simple. To brew ale, you boil the water. Boiling kills the microbes that would otherwise try to kill you. Then you ferment it, and the mild alcohol content keeps the bacteria from coming back. You're not trying to get drunk. You're trying not to get dysentery. And that's why even your children drink it. Yes, this is another historical quirk. Toddlers, old men, pregnant women, everyone in your family drinks ale because the only alternative is intestinal roulette. You sometimes water it down for the kids, but they still learn to prefer its sharp, sour fizz over the sweet, deadly temptation of stream water. You take another sip and sigh. This batch is, well, not the worst. There was a time the Brewster's batch exploded in the jug, some kind of wild fermentation. You lost half the week's supply to foam and hissing froth. The kids thought it was a demon. You weren't so sure. Historians still argue about how nutritious small ale actually was. Some say it was a vital calorie source, loaded with B vitamins and carbohydrates. Others argue it was mostly hydration, mild, safe liquid to wash down grit-filled bread and bitter greens. But you don't care about scholarly debates. It wets your throat. It doesn't kill you. That's enough. The Brewster, usually a woman, like most small-scale brewers in your village, signals when a new batch is ready by hanging a broom over her door. That's where the term ale steak comes from. And yes, quirky as it sounds, that broom pole is possibly the distant ancestor of the modern pub sign. Funny how history bubbles through. Your household doesn't brew often. You barely have enough grain to feed yourselves, let alone waste any on a fermentation experiment. But when the pot's too empty and the bread too sour, sometimes ale is the only comfort you can afford. You remember your father saying once, while drunk off the strong stuff reserved for feast days, "I'd rather die from ale than from thirst." And you remember your mother rolling her eyes, pouring him into bed, and muttering, "He's halfway there." You finish the mug and look around the room. Everyone else is sipping quietly too. The kids drink from wooden cups that used to hold milk back when your goat hadn't died. You think of her sometimes, not as a pet, as a meal. You rinse your cup, but not too thoroughly. Soap doesn't exist here, and clean water is precious. You give it a swipe with your sleeve and set upside down. Later, when you go to the well, you'll carry a separate jug. You'll draw from the bucket, sniff it, always sniff it, and maybe strain it through a bit of cloth. Not to remove bacteria, you don't know what that is, but to get the frog spawn, beetles, or bird droppings out. Sometimes you boil it for tea, but tea hasn't been invented yet, so you boil it for gruel. Or, if you're lucky, you just don't need to drink it at all. You stand by the window, if you can call two crooked shutters a window, and peer outside. Rain. Again, which is good. The stream might rise a little. Wash away whatever filth has been fermenting near the livestock pen. You'll still drink ale, though, because safety in this time doesn't taste sweet. It tastes sour, faintly bubbly, slightly warm, and absolutely essential. You pour another mug and toast no one to staying alive, even if it means getting tipsy at breakfast. Word spreads like wildfire, or at least like smoldering kindling. The Lord's eldest daughter is getting married. To you, it means one thing. Not music, not celebration, not new clothes. It means meat. Not your meat, of course. But sometimes on days like this, when the nobility throw a banquet for themselves, the scraps trickle down. Like bones to a dog. You hear it before you see it. The creak of wagon wheels on the muddy village road. The low grumble of voices. A cart appears from around the bend, guided by two of the Lord's men. There's no ceremony, no pageantry. Just a slow-moving pile of steaming animal remains. And it is glorious. Not the prime cuts. Those are being roasted on silver spits up in the manor kitchens. Your share is offal. Glistening red livers, coils of intestines, rubbery lungs, maybe even a severed head or two. You don't mind. You're already calculating how long each piece could last, what it might add to the stew, how long the taste might linger. This, after all, is a mainstream historical truth. For peasants, offal wasn't garbage. It was treasure. While the nobility dined on white meats and carved haunches, you made do with hearts, kidneys, and stomach linings. These bits, soaked in blood and dense with nutrients, were a rare and precious gift. There's no orderly queue, just a jostling crowd of hungry people trying to look casual while edging closer to the cart. The reeve stands nearby with a club in one hand, nodding at those who receive their portion. You wait your turn, your eyes locked on a piece of liver that still steams in the cool air. And somehow you get it. You cradle the liver like a newborn and hustle home. Inside, the pot is already warm. The fire has been coaxed to life. Your wife helps you slice the liver. The texture is soft, pliable, rich with blood and potential. The smell rises as soon as it hits the stone near the fire. That coppery, iron aroma you haven't smelled in months. Even the children stop their squabbling. They hover, wide-eyed, breathing in what might as well be perfume. You don't just toss the meat in whole. That would waste it. You dice it finely, fry a few bits if the fire is hot enough, and scatter the rest into the pottage. You stir slowly, watching the color darken, the sheen return to the broth. This stew has substance now. A quirky but telling tidbit from medieval kitchens. Intestines were cleaned, braided, and sometimes fried into a delicacy called chitlins. Not exactly crispy bacon, but when cooked properly, they gave off a meaty, savory pop of flavor, if you didn't mind the smell. You take the intestines from the cart, too. No one else wanted them. They need to be cleaned. Thoroughly. You trudge to the stream and begin the grim work. Squeezing, rinsing, gagging. But you've done worse. And the reward is worth it. Historians still argue about how often peasants truly got access to meat like this. Some records suggest it was a once-a-year event. Others think small amounts, organs, blood, skin, were more commonly available through barter or slaughter days. But what's agreed upon is this. When meat arrived, everything stopped. Tonight, everything does. Dinner is a quiet celebration. The stew is thicker, richer. It has flavor again. Real flavor. The children eat with both hands, eyes wide. Your wife smiles without meaning to. You chew slowly, savoring the texture of soft liver against your gritty bread. You even set aside a tiny portion for tomorrow. Just a scrap. Enough to make the pot taste like something more than regret. The world outside hasn't changed. The Lord still eats roast boar in a camel at hall. His daughter wears velvet. His guests laugh between gulps of wine. But here, in your smoky hut, you have a bowl of stew that tastes like triumph. And for one brief, unrepeatable moment, you feel full. The feast is over. The stew pot is returned to its usual watery, reluctant bubble. The liver is gone, digested, remembered, already slipping into the realm of fading memory. Your family slept well last night, not from comfort, but from calories. And now the ache in your belly is back. But this time it brings company. You taste it before you even eat, salt. Everything tastes of salt. You pull the next meal from the corner of the hut where it's been stored. A hunk of pork, stiff and gray, still dusted with grains of coarse, crude salt. You've had it since autumn, when the pig was slaughtered, butchered, and buried in barrels beneath layers of brine and rock-like crystals. Preservation, in your world, is a battle, and salt is your sword. This is a mainstream historical fact. Without refrigeration, salt was the key to long-term survival. You salted everything, meat, fish, sometimes even vegetables. Salt didn't enhance the flavor. It killed bacteria. It stopped rot. It turned perishable food into something that could sit unmoved for months, hard, dry, and basically immortal. But salt doesn't just change food. It changes you. Your fingers already sting just from handling the pork. You drop it into a bucket of water to soak. The water clouds immediately. The smell rises, stale fat, faintly rancid, unmistakably porkish. You'll change the water twice, maybe 3 times over the next day. Try to leach out as much salt as possible. It won't be enough. It never is. You try not to think about the taste. You remember last winter when your cousin tried to eat unsalted meat he'd kept too long. He thought he'd won, until 3 days later when his stomach twisted like rope and his breath soured. He didn't last a week. Better salty than dead. While you wait for the meat to soak, you stare at the barrel in the corner. The salt pork is packed deep, slabs stacked like firewood, crusted with frost-like crystals. The salt itself is filthy by modern standards, gray, gritty, unrefined. It smells like minerals and dirt in time, and it costs you dearly. Not just money, labor, trade, loyalty. Sometimes you give the Lord your best vegetables in return for a sack of salt. Sometimes you pay in favors. Sometimes you just go without. A quirky historical tidbit. Salt was so precious that in some places it was used as currency. The Roman word salarium, which gave us the word salary, was once a payment made in salt. In France, the hated Gabelle salt tax was one of the sparks that helped ignite a revolution. You wish you could revolt, but instead, you soak your meat. After hours, you fish out the chunk and press it with your thumb. It still resists. The flesh is dense, the fat rubbery. You slice off a bit and nibble it raw, just to check. It crunches with salt. You nearly choke. Into the pot it goes. Not the whole piece, just a strip. You have to ration. The saltiness will bleed into the pottage, giving it that strange mix of flavor and punishment. A stew that both feeds and scolds. The rest of the meat? Back into the salt barrel. Maybe next week. Maybe next month. Historians still argue whether this constant salting had long-term health effects on medieval populations. High blood pressure? Kidney strain? Perhaps. But in a world where starvation, plague, and infection kill most people before age 40, it's hard to separate salt from circumstance. The stew simmers. You stir it, watching the broth darken. The smell, smoky, meaty, pungent, draws your family to the fire. You serve them in silence. The children wince at the first bite. It stings their tongues. But then they keep eating, because hunger is louder than salt. Hunger tells them this is delicious. You chew slowly, chasing pieces of meat with sips of ale, trying to dilute the chemical burn. There's a moment where you think, this is too much. Then you remember last week, when all you had was boiled weeds. And you keep chewing. This isn't seasoning. This is defense. Salt has taken your pig and turned into stone, but edible stone. Preserved. Permanent. And for that, you're grateful. Kind of. You glance upward at the rafters of your hut. Thick beams of roughly hewn wood, blackened by years of smoke. Up there, barely visible in the gloom, hang the rest of the pig. The parts you couldn't salt. The sides of bacon. A couple of long, ropey sausages. Slabs of meat so dark and stiff they might be mistaken for firewood. The smoke curls up from your hearth in gentle threads, winding around the meat, leaving behind the sharp, bitter perfume of preservation. You don't think of it as a flavor. You think of it as armor. This is your second weapon against rot. Smoke. After salting, smoking is your only defense. And it's not elegant. There's no careful cold smoking setup, no temperature gauge, no special wood selected for their fragrant properties. You burn what you have, green branches, damp peat, straw, even dry dung if it comes to that. The smoke is thick, acrid, and relentless. It stings your eyes, clings to your clothes, coats the walls with soot, and seeps deep into the meat. This method is ancient and a mainstream historical fact. Medieval peasants relied on open hearth smoking to preserve meat through the months when fresh food was scarce. It was messy, inconsistent, and incredibly smoky, but it worked. You climb onto a stool and tug gently at one of the bacon slabs. It resists. The outside is greasy with soot, the skin leathery and dark. You slice off a strip and sniff it. Smells like fire and dust. Tastes like bitterness and time. You scrape off the outer crust with your knife, revealing a pale, salty layer beneath. Not appetizing, exactly, but edible. It's not just meat up there. Your wife has strung up wild mushrooms on a bit of twine. Their thin caps now shriveled and dusty. A few wrinkled apple slices dangle near the hearth. Every spare inch of dry air is in use. A quirky detail. Drying was the most accessible preservation method for things like beans, peas, fruit, and fungi. No salt needed. No smoke. Just air and patience. But it came with its own enemy. Mold. You check the beans laid out on the cloth near the wall. They look fine. Hard as rocks. Yes, but fine. You bite one. Regret it instantly. But they'll soften eventually in the pot. Probably. Still, there's always something threatening the stars. You see it in the corners of your eye, a black spot on a slab of meat, a puff of white fuzz on the edge of a drying apple. You scratch it off, hoping it hasn't spread. You have no margin for error. Historians still argue whether peasants could accurately tell dangerous mold from harmless ones. There's no conclusive evidence. But you rely on smell. If it burns your nose, if it slimes your fingers, if the chickens won't go near it, it's gone. The rats don't care. You hear them at night, scrabbling along the beams. Sometimes they get into the beans. Sometimes they gnaw through the ropes and send a piece of precious bacon tumbling into the ashes. Your traps are crude. You haven't caught one in weeks. You shift your gaze to the grain sacks. You already know what you'll find. The telltale holes, the squirming larvae, the flour, such as it is riddled with weevils. You sift them out with your fingers. Not all of them. Never all of them. Another fun, if stomach-turning tidbit. People in your position routinely consumed insects without realizing it. Weevils, mites, tiny worms. They were just part of the food chain. Uninvited protein. You take your share of the flour and set it aside for tomorrow's bread. You won't think about it again. Instead, you reach for the pot. You take a thin strip of the smoked bacon, boil it to soften it a bit, then dice it small. It hisses slightly as it hits the hot water. The broth darkens instantly. The stew will taste different today. Stronger, saltier, maybe even too smoky. But you've stopped caring about too much anything. You stir, scrape the sides, adjust the flame. The hut smells like ash and iron. When it's time to eat, you ladle out portions carefully. You chew around the hard edges. The children don't even notice. They're used to it. You wonder if, centuries from now, someone will sit in a clean kitchen and talk about the rich, rustic flavor of smoked bacon like it's some old delicacy. You hope they remember the soot in your eyes, the black crust on your ceiling, the way you choked on preservation just to make it to spring. You drink your ale. You chew your pottage. You scrape the bowl. Then you scrape the pot. And start again. You wake to a strange smell. Not the usual smoky soup of hearth, mold, and wet wool, but something sharp, acidic, sour in a way that make your nostrils sting and your stomach clench. It's the bread. You stumble across the room and lift the cloth from yesterday's loaf, the dark rye that you left cooling on the shelf. The smell hits harder now. It's sharper than vinegar. Your wife's already noticed too. She lifts a corner and turns it over. Black specks. Not ash. Not dirt. Something worse. You both recognize it immediately. You've seen it before. So has everyone in the village. But no one talks about it unless they have to. Because when you see this, when your bread smells like rot and dances with purple-black curls, it might already be too late. The loaf is poisoned. This is ergot. This is fire. This is death. A mainstream historical fact. Ergot is a fungus, Claviceps purpurea, that infects rye, especially after cold winters followed by damp springs. The very conditions you've just had. The fungus looks like dark kernels mixed into the grain, but once ground into flour, it's invisible. It can lurk in your bread for days before revealing itself. And once eaten, it becomes a nightmare. Your neighbors remember the last outbreak, the way people screamed in their beds, the way limbs blackened, shriveled, and broke off like dry twigs, the convulsions, the hallucinations, the whispers of demons, the way the priest clutched his crucifix and said it was the devil's bread. You call it St. Anthony's fire, and it burns in two ways. You remember both forms. There's the gangrenous kind. That's the one that takes your fingers, your toes. The blood vessels constrict, the flesh dies, and limbs fall off silently. No blood, no pain, just numbness, then absence. And then there's the convulsive kind. That one twists your body. It makes your arms jerk uncontrollably. It makes your eyes roll back. It makes you see monsters in the walls, feel spiders under your skin. It makes you scream until your voice gives out, and then scream more. Historians still argue how common these outbreaks were, or how well people understood the cause. Some say peasants knew to avoid dark kernels in their rye. Others claim they had no idea and simply accepted it as divine punishment or bad luck. Either way, once it's in the bread, there's no going back. You stare at the loaf, stomach turning. What now? Burn it? You can't afford to waste bread. You tear off a piece and nibble the edge. The taste is sharp, not just sour, chemical, bitter in a way that sticks to your tongue. Your wife watches, horrified. You spit it out. The rest of the loaf goes into the fire. You watch it blacken, hiss, and crumble into soot. For a moment, it smells sweet like caramel. Then it smells like death again. A fringe belief you've heard whispered in the village. That ergot bread lets you see the future. That it opens your mind to the spirit world. The old woman by the well once claimed she saw angels during the last outbreak. She also lost 2 toes and her youngest son. You don't want visions. You want to survive. But now you're scared. Was it just this loaf? Or is it in the flour? You dig through the sack and stare. Every kernel looks the same. Some are just darker, thicker, shaped a little off. Could be ergot. Might not be. You pick a few out. Toss them aside. But how many did you miss? You kneel down and whisper to the pot as if it will tell you. You think about the last few weeks, about how strange your dreams have been, about the flickering shadow you saw in the field yesterday. Was that a fox? Or were you already poisoned? You don't sleep that night. Neither does your wife. Your children mercifully do. The next morning, you check everyone's fingers. Toes, eyes, all clear. For now, you take the flour sack out to the edge of the garden and bury it. Deep. Then you start again. New grain, from the little that remains. But still, every time you chew, you wonder, is this the bite? The one that burns? The one that rots? The one that makes you dream of demons and wakes you screaming? Is this the day the fire starts? The sound reaches you before the sight does. A slow, grating rhythm of stone grinding against stone. The village mill is awake. You sling your empty grain sack over one shoulder and make the walk, boots squelching through the wet clay road, the same one you've walked since childhood. This is where your grain becomes bread, where your future becomes flour. It is also where you get robbed. Quietly, legally, inevitably, you step into the shadow of the mill, the sails turning lazily above like the bones of some giant bird. The air smells of dust, mold, and grain. Inside, the great stones grind endlessly. The miller greets you with a nod. His hands are white with flour, and his apron is stained with meals he didn't earn. This is a mainstream historical fact. Milling was a monopoly. In most villages, the lord owned the mill, and by law, all the peasants had to use it. You couldn't grind your own grain. That would be theft. So you brought your harvest to the miller, who took his cut, usually 1/16th, sometimes more. You hold out your grain. He weighs it. He grunts. He doesn't ask. He just takes. That's the miller's right. You stand there, watching your hard-earned kernels vanish into the hopper, watching the flour trickle out like white sand. The part that goes into your sack is lighter than it should be. The part the miller keeps disappears behind a curtain. You know he's skimming. Everyone knows. But what are you going to do, complain? To whom? You shoulder the sack and leave. The flour inside is coarse, flecked with husk, maybe even a few pebbles. You'll sift it later, or you won't. Your teeth are already ground down from years of chewing maslin bread. What's one more stone between friends? You pause outside and glance back. The miller's window is open. Inside, he's whistling. He's baking. With your flour. You don't hate him. Not exactly. You envy him. Because here's a fringe fact not often discussed in history books. Millers were among the wealthiest peasants. More than that, people feared them. They controlled food. They worked closely with the lord. They knew who had grain and who didn't. That made them useful and dangerous. You've heard rumors, always whispered, about millers adulterating flour, mixing in chalk to stretch it, sawdust even, nothing proven. But when your loaf comes out strangely light, strangely sour, strangely brittle, well, you think about it. Still, what choice do you have? You walk home with your sack of maybe flour, trying to guess how many loaves it'll make. You'll add oats, maybe some ground peas to stretch it. The result will be rough, heavy, dry, but it will be yours. You reach your hut and set the sack down by the hearth. Your wife opens it, scoops out a handful, and immediately pulls out a black speck. A stone. You both nod. Par for the course. She mixes the flour with water, kneads it by hand, her palms coated in white sludge. You sit beside her, helping where you can, clearing the table, stoking the fire, preparing the flat stone where the loaf will bake. The dough rises barely. There's no yeast, no starter, no magic. Just time and hope. She bakes it over the coals. No oven, just radiant heat and the patience of someone who's done this 1,000 times. Later, you tear off a piece. It's dense, damp in the middle, a bit sour. Your teeth scrape across something hard. Probably grit. You chew anyway. Historians still debate whether peasants ate better or worse than we think. Some claim that even rough bread was nutritious, full of whole grains, fiber, and minerals. Others argue that poor milling, spoiled flour, and adulteration made every meal a health hazard. You don't know what nutrition is. You just know your jaw hurts. And that tomorrow, you'll need to go back to the mill and pay. Again. So tonight, you eat quietly, chew slowly, swallow grit, swear silently, and dream of a world where flour belongs to the hands that grew it. Summer comes late and suddenly. One morning you step outside and notice the mud has dried into cracked patterns beneath your feet. The air smells different, not warm exactly, but less cruel. There are flies again, bees. The nettles are taller. The trees were a soft green haze, like they've only just remembered they're alive. And so have you. Your body is thinner now. Everyone's is. But the hunger no longer feels like a death sentence. just a constant hum in the background. You've survived the hungry gap. Barely, but there's still nothing to eat. Not yet. The barley is growing, but it's green. The peas have begun to flower, but not pod. The rye is waist-high, but still tight in the head. The promise of food is everywhere, but it's all locked, just out of reach. Weeks away, maybe more. So you do what every peasant does in the early summer. You wait. You ration. You stretch. You pray for rain, and then pray for it to stop. You forage the edges of the forest again, hoping, this time, the mushrooms are friends. And sometimes you steal. Just a little. You pass the Lord's wheat fields on the way to the well. The stalks sway, bright and gold-tipped. It looks like treasure. You pause, glance around, and snap off a single head. Just one. You rub it between your palms, blow away the chaff, and chew the raw kernels. They're soft, milky, alive. You don't feel guilty. The Lord's granary is full. Yours is a memory, a quirky and grim historical fact. Gleaning, collecting leftover grain after harvest, was one of the few legal ways peasants, especially women and children, could gather food from noble fields. But before the harvest, that was theft. Even one stalk, and it could land you in court or worse. You chew faster. It's not just hunger anymore, it's something else. You miss food, real food, not just the act of eating, but the feeling of looking forward to eating. You remember the way the first cabbage of the season used to taste, how your mother used to boil it in beer and pretend it was stew. You remember wild strawberries crushed in the palm of your hand, eaten still warm from the sun. The memory is almost worse than the hunger. Your wife has been saving a surprise, a handful of dried mint hidden behind the hearth since winter. Today, she crumbles it into the pottage. The effect is immediate. The hut smells like flavor. The kids sit up straighter. Even you stop chewing to taste something. It doesn't last long, but it reminds you that food is more than fuel. It can be hope, too. Another fringe truth. The medieval pour new herbs better than most of us today. Out of necessity, not curiosity. You grew them on your tuft. You gathered them in the hedgerows. Mint, sage, parsley thyme, anything that could mask rot or stretch a stew. Your mouth remembers what your stomach rarely receives. You decide, tomorrow, to search the hedges for sorrel. It tastes sour like lemons. Not filling, but bright. You miss brightness. That night, the fire burns low, and for once your belly is not empty. Not full, but not screaming. The stew was thin, but the mint tricked your brain. You sit in the doorway of your hut and watch the sky. The clouds roll lazily. The air feels soft. You realize with a kind of awe that you made it, that the worst is behind you. And you let yourself wonder, what if next year is better? You immediately regret it, because hope is dangerous. It makes you slow. It makes you expect. And in this life, you cannot afford to expect. You rise, stretch your aching limbs, and step back inside. Tomorrow, you'll wake up hungry again. But tomorrow, the peas might open. Tomorrow, the barley might bend. Tomorrow, the pot might taste better. And somehow, that's enough to keep you going. Rain again. It hasn't stopped for 3 days, and your roof leaks in 5 places. You've placed bowls beneath the worst of them, but now the bowls are full and the floor is slick with mud and soot. The fire coughs and sputters. The pottage barely simmers. Your wife's trying to dry greens by the hearth, but everything smells like wet wool and smoke. And yet, despite the cold and the damp, despite the rain snaking down the inside of your collar, there's a strange tension in the air. The Lord is holding a feast. You wouldn't care, except that you've been invited. Not by name, not by grace, but by need. Every so often, the Lord remembers the peasants. A death, a wedding, a treaty, anything to excuse a show of wealth disguised as generosity. And on these rare days, you are summoned to work, to carry, to serve, to wash, and, if you're lucky, to taste what real food is. Today, you're one of the lucky ones. You've been assigned to help with the trenchers. A mainstream historical fact. Medieval banquets didn't use plates the way we know them. They used trenchers, thick slabs of stale bread, sometimes round, sometimes square, often days old. Food was piled on top, soaked in sauce, carved apart with fingers and knives. When the nobles were finished, they might give the trenchers to the poor. Or to the dogs. You're counting on the former. You arrive early. You carry baskets of crusted loaves and split them, stacking them like firewood. You try not to gawk at the kitchens. There are whole chickens on spits. Trays of roasted root vegetables. Spices. Smells. You don't even recognize half of them. Something sweet, something sharp, something foreign. You are told not to touch anything. You nod and do as you're told. You pass goblets to lords with embroidered sleeves. You kneel when spoken to. You back out of rooms with your eyes on the floor. You are invisible, but watching everything. A boy your age, dressed in velvet, drops half a pheasant leg onto the ground. He doesn't pick it up. He just laughs and reaches for another. Your fingers twitch. You think about grabbing it, but you know better. You keep working. And then, finally, the trenchers start coming back. Sodden, flattened, covered in meat, juices, and little scraps of skin and fat, and, miracle of miracles, sauce. You and the other helpers are given the signal. You descend like birds. You tear the trenchers apart. You fight a little, not with fists, but with elbows and speed. You get 2 pieces, one soaked through, soft as pudding, one drier, but streaked with gravy. You don't wait. You eat right there, standing in the corridor, licking your fingers like a child. It tastes. You can't describe it. There's salt and fat and spice. Something warm and earthy. Maybe nutmeg? You've only smelled that once before at the market, years ago. It's luxurious. Even though the bread is days old and falling apart, it's better than anything you've eaten in months. You savor every bite. You don't speak to the others. They're too busy chewing. A fringe historical fact. Some monasteries and noble houses had policies for distributing leftover trenchers to the poor daily. These stale, soggy bread planks became a sort of welfare. Soaked in flavor, dignity long gone, but desperately needed. You feel no shame. Later, as the feast winds down, you help clear the platters. One of the kitchen boys winks and hands you a bone with meat still on it. You don't ask questions. You nod, tuck it into your tunic, and pretend it isn't there until you're home. That night, by the fire, you and your wife and children gnaw the bone clean. It's not enough, but it feels like enough. Because today, you tasted something richer than survival. You tasted flavor. And for just one night, your dreams aren't about famine or fire or rot. They're about honeyed sauces, golden trenchers, and warm bread that soaks up everything except your sorrow. The year turns again. You don't mock it with calendars. You don't need to. You feel it in your knees when the damp sets in your throat when the hearth smoke hangs low, in your bones when the wind shifts and suddenly everything tastes of ash. Autumn was hard, winter harder. Spring nearly killed you. Summer teased. But now it's harvest again, and you've survived. Barely. You sit on the threshold of your hut, looking out at the road that's carried more burdens than joy. You sip weak ale. You chew a piece of bread that isn't fresh, but at least isn't mold. The stew tonight is familiar. A few beans, a wilted cabbage leaf, and water that's been boiled until it forgets it was once filthy. The taste. You don't really taste anything anymore. That's the thing no one talks about. Not in songs, or in stories, or in sermons. The slow erasure of joy from eating. Not because you're full, but because food has become routine, not ritual. Every bowl, every crust, every bite is the same. Survival. Nothing more. Historians often argue about the variety in medieval diets, how many vegetables peasants could grow, how many herbs they might have used. But that's the wrong question. It's not what's possible. It's what's practical. What's left after the Lord takes his share. What's still edible after storage. What hasn't been chewed by rats. What hasn't turned green, or black, or sour. You eat what's left. You always eat what's left. The food has no color now. No brightness, just gray upon gray, brown upon brown. Smoke, salt, sour, grit, those are the flavors you've learned to expect. If you get something sweet, it's an accident. If you get something soft, it's because it wasn't stored long enough to dry into stone. You miss fruit. Not often, but when you do, it's not apples or pears. It's the juice. The drip of sweetness on your tongue. The shock of it. Like your mouth remembering something it forgot it loved. Now, it only remembers routine. The stew, the bread, the ale, smoke, salt, sour, grit. There's one bite left in your bowl. You hesitate, not because you're full, but because you don't want to finish. The last bite is always the hardest, not because you want more, because you know there isn't any. You eat it. You scrape the bowl. You set it down. You stay at the fire, not because it's warm, because there's nothing else to look at. No songs, no books, no distraction but the dance of embers and the occasional cough from your sleeping children. Outside, a dog barks once. Then silence. You sit in that silence and you think, not about the next meal, but about how this one tasted like every other meal. And how next week's will too. And how the year will turn again, and again, and again. And how the stew pot, in its own quiet way, is eternal. You wonder if you'll ever taste something truly new. Something that makes you sit up, gasp, close your eyes. Something you'll remember for the rest of your life. You wonder, and then you laugh. Because here, food isn't for remembering. It's for enduring. And tonight, like every night, you've endured. You miss fruit. Not often. But when you do, it's not apples or pears. It's the juice. The drip of sweetness on your tongue. The shock of it. Like your mouth remembering something it forgot it loved. Now, it only remembers routine. The stew, the bread, the ale, smoke, salt, sour, grit. There's one bite left in your bowl. You hesitate, not because you're full, but because you don't want to finish. The last bite is always the hardest. Not because you want more, because you know there isn't any. You eat it. You scrape the bowl. You set it down. You stay at the fire. Not because it's warm, because there's nothing else to look at. No songs, no books, no distraction but the dance of embers and the occasional cough from your sleeping children. Outside, a dog barks once. Then silence. You sit in that silence and you think, not about the next meal, but about how this one tasted like every other meal. And how next week's will too. And how the year will turn again, and again, and again. And how the stew pot, in its own quiet way, is eternal. You wonder if you'll ever taste something truly new. Something that makes you sit up, gasp, close your eyes. Something you'll remember for the rest of your life. You wonder, and then you laugh. Because here, food isn't for remembering. It's for enduring. And tonight, like every night, you've endured.